This Friday, Jamie Lee Curtis and Lindsay Lohan are back to switch things up in Disney's Freakier Friday.
Totally, yes.
It's an absolute riot,
Woo!
and the only movie that can be described as
So much weirder than the last time.
What last time?
it's the frequel
You ready?
we've been waiting for.
That absolutely slays.
What deeply out of touch old person came up with that?
You did.
Wow.
Don't miss the comedy event of the summer for all ages. Disney's Freakier Friday in theaters this Friday. Get tickets now. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested.
Pie in the Sky Media. This series contains adult language and descriptions of graphic violence throughout. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome back to Criminal Mischief with Carolyn and Brandon. You're listening to episode 115, The Revenge of Betty Broderick. The sun had just risen early that Sunday morning on November 5th, 1989. It was quiet and peaceful, and at 5:30 in the morning, most people on Cypress Avenue were still sleeping. The neighborhood, Marsden Hill, is one of the oldest in San Diego, where prominent attorney Dan Broderick and his new wife Linda lived. The upscale neighborhood was one of the most prestigious in the city, a tranquil, wonderful place to live. And the Broderick home was imposing. The front facade was made of brick, with lots of windows, and a large white front door. That morning, when everyone was sleeping, a woman pulled up in the front of the home. She gets out of her vehicle and begins walking toward the residence. Even though she had a key to the front door, she made her way to a utility door at the back of the house. You see, this woman wasn't just any woman. She was very familiar with the layout of the home, and she knew that if she opened the front door, there was a chance that even though it was early in the morning, she would be heard by Dan and Linda inside. Because at the foot of the front door, there was a staircase that led to the second floor, and very near the steps to the left was the main bedroom where the couple slept. Which is why the woman slid her key into the back door, pushed it open, and went inside, silently passing the kitchen as she made her way to the front door and then quietly crept up the carpeted steps of the staircase. Slowly, she took one step at a time. By then, her .38 caliber Smith & Wesson was in her hand, her finger poised on the trigger. That type of pistol held only 5 bullets. Dan and Linda's bedroom was immediately to the left of the stairs. She continued down the hall, knowing that there was a TV room that led to another door into the main bedroom, and that door was slightly open. She pushed her way inside and stood over 28-year-old Linda, who was asleep on her back. And there, next to her, 44-year-old Dan was sleeping on his side. The couple had been married for 6 months and were actually trying to start a family. But that morning, in the quiet as they lay sleeping, totally helpless, the intruder pointed her gun and began shooting. She wasn't a contracted hit woman. She was a scorned woman who would have her revenge.
All she wanted to do was talk about how much she hated Dan and Linda. One of her specific statements was, "That little fucker was mine, and he'll stay mine."
And this would be a double homicide that became a media spectacle. The shocking details: infidelity, wealth, and a mom, a once beautiful socialite who gunned down her ex and his younger wife, who showed no signs of remorse.
Did she have a motive? Absolutely. And it's probably the oldest and most common motive there is, of hate. Pure, unadulterated, intense, obsessive, jealous hate. But hell hath no fury like a woman scorned.
The murders were so salacious. The question became, what made Betty Broderick do it?
My life had become a scream in the dark. I had felt like he was all powerful in that legal system, and I had no defense whatever.
Well, Dan, let me interrupt you here. Dan and Linda, of course, are not here to tell their side of the story, but Dan's brother Larry has spoken out against Betty throughout this tragedy, and here he tells his feelings about Betty.
This woman is an incredible monster, and Dan had to put up with her and her greed and her avariciousness and her hate for his entire married life and for 5 years after it.
Elizabeth Biscaglia met Daniel T. Broderick in 1965 at a Notre Dame football game. Elizabeth, or Betty, was a smart and vivacious college student who was very attractive. And Dan was a fraternity guy who had big aspirations. He had plans to become a doctor, and from the very beginning, he was not only infatuated with Betty, he knew that he wanted to marry her. The pair began a love affair through letters, because he was still at Notre Dame, and she attended college in New York, where she was working toward a degree in early childhood education. It seemed that the couple had a lot in common. They both came from large Catholic families and shared similar values. You get married, have children, and work very hard toward building a successful life together. After attending Notre Dame, Dan moved to New York to start medical school. In 1969, Betty and Dan were married. Their wedding photo captured what appeared to be a very happy-looking couple. Betty was a beautiful bride, and Dan was a studious-looking young man with wire-rimmed glasses and a really nice smile. On their honeymoon, Betty became pregnant with their first child, Kim, in 1970. They had another daughter, Lee, in 1971. But when Dan graduated from medical school, he set his sights on going to Harvard Law School with the goal of leveraging both degrees to become an attorney who specialized in medical malpractice. Now, throughout medical school and law school, Betty not only took care of the kids, but she also worked several jobs in between to support their growing family. She gave birth to Daniel in 1976 and Rhett in 1979. Betty would babysit during the day, she sold cosmetics and Tupperware door to door, and also worked as a hostess at restaurants at night when the children were asleep and Dan was studying. After all that hard work, Dan earned his law degree and the family relocated to San Diego, where he was hired by a prestigious law firm. But even with Dan's new job, money was still tight for the family, and Betty continued to take care of the kids and work at part-time jobs to help contribute to the family's income. Dan and Betty were able to buy a house after they received an insurance settlement when the place they were living in caught on fire. They used the money to buy their first home in La Jolla, which they would refer to as their Coral Reef home. Betty says that in 1978, she continued to help support Dan when together they took a leap of faith, and he left the security of a prestigious law firm to go out on his own.
You could have said I pushed him, but the real word is I wholeheartedly supported him and said, yes, I'm behind you 150%. Even if we lose the house, we can do this, because it was scary.
Even though Dan was extremely good at what he did, when he went out on his own, he didn't have any clients, which meant he didn't have a steady paycheck, and they were living on credit.
Yes, he had the finest looking office in town, and he had no clients, and that was my insistence.
And the family did not suffer any detriment by him doing that. He was immediately successful, correct?
He was very shortly thereafter successful, but because of the way the cases go, he didn't have a paycheck in the first, year or so, or a year and a half, or because of the nature of his cases. He didn't have people pay him by the hour, ever.
But it wasn't long before Dan's practice began to really pay off. And at long last, some real money was coming in. Now, after so much struggle and so much hard work, they could finally live the lives that they had always dreamed of. That he would be a successful attorney who provided an amazing life for their family, and that she had what she wanted, to be a devoted wife and mother. Here's Betty describing her life as she saw it before the murders to Oprah in 1992.
So you were the soccer mom, and you were the chauffeur.
I was everything.
I
was Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, the soccer coach, the T-ball, orthodontist. Each child had music lessons. Each child had some sort of sport. I took them all on summer vacations when Dan would never go with us because I do real children things, and he doesn't like He didn't like a lot of noise and confusion, and that's what 4 children are, and I loved it.
And so in your mind, you were the perfect mom.
Yes, I was, and in a lot of other people's minds as well.
Was it difficult though, Betty, being super mom? Because did you feel pressured? Did you feel isolated? Did you feel that you weren't getting enough from your husband?
Being a super mom was the only thing I ever wanted to be in life. I did not feel any urge to go out in the world and be successful in business or anything. We had very strict gender lines in our marriage. Dan, went out and slayed the dragons and provided for us, and I was home and hearth and children and support my husband emotionally and through the good times and the bad.
And you enjoyed that?
I loved it. It's all I've ever wanted to do.
But life wasn't bliss. There were cracks in the relationship. Dan had always been a workaholic, but now, according to Betty, he seemed unhappy.
Dan was never a womanizer. I never doubted where he was going. We had total trust in one another, as we should have, because we were committed. But in 1983, I noticed Dan at a party talking about some girl that he thought was really beautiful. And that was my first clue that Linda Kolkina existed.
Betty believed that if Dan spent more time with her and the children, that things would get better. And in 1983, she was thrilled when she found out that Dan had hired an assistant. Up until that point, he'd worked alone. And now that he had someone to help him, she was over the moon because she felt like he'd be able to spend more time with her and the children. But she had a rude awakening when she found out that the person that he'd hired as his assistant was 21-year-old Linda Kolkina. Linda had worked in the main office as a secretary before Dan had hired her to be his personal legal assistant. Over time, Betty became suspicious of Dan's relationship with Linda. She believed that he was having a midlife crisis.
To me, it was an absolute classic midlife crisis. And I devoured every book on the subject.
To the point of even he got the red Corvette, is that true?
Got the red Corvette, the risky business sunglasses, the scarf around his neck, the leather jacket. I told him he was the American joke. If only he would go to a therapist of some sort. But he wouldn't.
Betty went about trying to improve her appearance for Dan. And on his 39th birthday, she went to his office to surprise him. She'd gotten all dressed up and brought a bottle of champagne and a gift with the intention of celebrating his special day with him at the office and then take him out to dinner. When she arrived, she saw balloons and it appeared that there had already been a celebration. Someone in the office would tell Betty that Dan and Linda had gone out to lunch and that they hadn't come back yet, which had been hours before. Betty waited at the office, but when Dan and Linda didn't return, she went home, gathered up his clothes, and in a blind rage threw them off the balcony, then went into the garage, retrieved a gas can, doused his clothes, and lit them on fire. When Dan came home, Betty confronted him, and Dan totally denied having an affair with Linda. In fact, he turned it on her, saying it was all in her head and that she was crazy.
Because I was so upset that he didn't come home and he was treating me so bad. And he kept denying the affair and telling me that I was imagining things and stuff. And I said, you get rid of that girl at the office or get out of my house. And he said, well, there's nothing going on with that girl. You're crazy. And by the way, this is my house. And if you don't like something, you can get out.
It was during this time that Dan, Betty, and the kids had to temporarily relocate from their Coral Reef home to a rental property. Apparently, during an inspection, it was revealed that there was a crack in the foundation. And in the meantime, Dan would continue to have an affair with Linda while denying it to Betty. Things would come to a head in February of 1985, when after 16 years of marriage, Dan would leave Betty. He moved out of the rental house, where they were living together with the kids, and back into the Coral Reef home while it was still under construction. Betty, knowing that throughout their marriage, Dan's role had never been the one to take care of the children. So in an effort to prove her point that Dan needed her, she dropped the kids off at the Coral Reef home, believing that Dan, as a workaholic, would never be able to handle the 4 kids without her. In fact, Betty would tell her friends that if she wasn't going to be Mrs. Dan T. Broderick, he can take care of the kids, adding, "See what woman wants him with 4 kids." But this move would backfire. Dan used it to legally gain full custody of all the children. And on top of that, he would file for divorce and would become very open in his relationship with Linda. If Dan thought that Betty would accept this, that not only had he left her for a younger woman, but that he had also stripped her of her children, especially after everything that they had been through together, he was in for a rude awakening, because Betty was not going to go away quietly. In fact, this was just the beginning of a brutal, drawn-out divorce that would take years. Prosecutor Carrie Wells.
If Elizabeth Broderick was angry about things and felt that he owed her before the marriage ended, Dan Broderick was totally unprepared for what was to come in.
In the ensuing years, Betty claimed that Dan used his influence as a prominent lawyer who was the president of the San Diego Bar Association to make it impossible for her to get a fair divorce settlement, and that he used this influence to get sole custody of their children. During these years, Betty would leave horrible, threatening messages on their answering machine.
I actually love this machine because then I can really just say anything I want. Tell the kids that you don't think it's wrong that you're screwing the cunt in the hall that has their legs wide open for anybody who comes by. And you're paid for it? God, you got a sense of humor. I love it. You're all... Stop screwing the cunt long enough to return my call. Left messages on the machine, with the maid, with the secretary, etc., etc. I have very important things to ask you. You're making me mad. I'll kill you. Someone really told me you're afraid of me. You better damn well be afraid of me and keep pulling shit like this. Better pay this insurance bill now, or you're gonna be damn afraid of me.
Here is a heartbreaking message that she left for her 7-year-old son.
Look, this is Mommy. I'm out of the shower now. Where are you? You can make a choice today about staying with me or staying with the cunt sucker.
Betty lashed out constantly because she just couldn't let go.
She didn't even want to talk about the children. All she wanted to do was talk about how much she hated Dan and Linda. One of her specific statements was, "That little fucker was mine, and he'll stay mine."
Hey there, Criminal Mischief Nation. So we all know it's not easy drinking the recommended amount of water every day, even though we know it's good for us. I mean, it is kind of incredible that 60% of our bodies are made of water. And yet a lot of us, me included, have to fight tooth and nail to get in that daily recommended amount. So cheers to drinking the healthy stuff. I mean, I don't want to get all doom and gloom, but the reality is that not all tap water is free of harmful contaminants. So if you want to make sure that you and your family are drinking ick-free water, you gotta check out AquaTrue. AquaTrue purifiers use a 4-stage reverse osmosis purification process, which basically means there's a lot of good stuff going on inside this slick-looking countertop purifier, which is easy to just plug in with no installation or plumbing. And in doing so, it will remove 15 times more contaminants than ordinary pitcher filters and are specifically designed to combat chemicals like PFAS in your water supply. Best of all, the water tastes fantastic. But seriously, not only can I truly taste the difference compared with my old water filter, but there's also that peace of mind that comes with knowing my water is clean. And AquaTrue comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee. And today, Criminal Mischief listeners will receive 20% off any AquaTrue purifier. Just go to aquatrue.com, that's AQUATRU.com, and enter code MISCHIEF at checkout. That's 20% off any AquaTrue water purifier when you go to aquatrue.com and use promo code MISCHIEF. That's MISCHIEF. When Betty went over to visit the kids at the Coral Reef home, she would pump them for information about Dan and Linda's life together. On one such visit, she saw a Boston cream pie and asked who made it. When the kids said that Linda had made it for their dad because it was his favorite, she became unhinged. smearing the pie all over his bed sheets, pillow, and clothes. After that, Dan changed the locks on the house, which caused her to ransack the entire place.
But she wouldn't take the kids back, even though at that point he would have willingly let her. They were a tremendous handful for him. And she has lots of excuses for that now. She started acting out in other destructive ways. On one occasion, she went out and bought a can of black spray paint and spray painted all over the inside and outside of the house. On another occasion, she took a pie and smeared it all over his clothes and the bedspread and the carpet. She'd throw rocks at his car, rip off his antenna, dump trash in the front yard. This sort of thing was going on for months and months after the separation, right after the separation. It was such a traumatic time for these kids, and these things were making it very difficult. Dan Broderick pleaded with her to stop, but her response was basically that it was her house too, and it was, and so she could do anything she wanted.
In 1986, Dan would put the Coral Reef house on the market. Betty told him that she wouldn't sell it unless he gave her more than 50% of the proceeds. And Dan agreed, but then she said no, she wanted more. When he agreed to give her more, she told him that she wasn't interested in selling the house. Ultimately, a judge would allow him to put the house on the market without Betty's consent. And when she found out that it had sold in March of 1986, she went ballistic. She went to Coral Reef, smashed the sliding glass door with a brick, went inside, and poured gasoline all over the carpet. But it wouldn't ignite like she hoped. So she then drove her Suburban to Dan's house. By this time, he was living at the home on Cypress Avenue. She then proceeded to ram the grill of her vehicle into the front door repeatedly. Dan and the kids were at home. Any one of them could have been walking in front of the door during this blitz attack. Thankfully, they weren't. Dan called the police, and Betty would be transported to a mental hospital and placed on a 3-day hold. As for Dan, he got a restraining order against Betty. After years, Dan and Betty's contentious divorce would be finalized in March of 1989. Betty would contest the fact that she didn't get custody of the younger children, and she appealed that decision that March, and also bought a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson, which she began practice shooting at a gun range. She also started putting that gun in her pocket whenever Dan came to pick up the boys. On April 22, 1989, Dan would marry Linda in the front yard of their Marsden Hills home. They hired 2 armed guards. They knew that Betty had stolen Dan and Linda's wedding list and had threatened to kill them on their wedding day. After the wedding, Betty claimed that Linda had mailed her envelopes that had ads for wrinkle cream and diets, just to turn the screw. However, it's not clear why, 7 months later, on November 5th, 1989, that Betty got up early. Her 10 and 13-year-old boys, who she was trying to get full custody of, were sleeping at her house, as was her boyfriend, Brad. Betty knew that Dan and Linda would be in the home alone. What specifically pushed her over the edge? Was it the thought that with the divorce settled, there was nothing tying them together? What exactly triggered her to pull out of the driveway of her $650,000 home in La Jolla, a residence that had 4 bedrooms, 6.5 bathrooms, a pool, a jacuzzi, and an ocean view? And at that time, Dan was paying her alimony of $16,000 a month. Later, even she would say that it wasn't about the money.
Well, the only way I know how to describe it now is that there was all these thoughts just churning in my head, and there was so much going on inside my head. That's kind of like my eyeballs were turned backwards, and the whole world was inside my head because of all this anguish. And so I wasn't seeing where I was going, and it was like I was just inward, and there was all this anguish and kind of darkness and crazy thoughts. Felt like you were in hell, actually.
It was before sunrise when Betty drove to Dan and Linda's home with her Smith & Wesson in the glove compartment.
And what did you do when you went into their bedroom?
Well, the motion that I made, although I don't think it was a big motion, the movement that I made into their bedroom woke them up, and they moved and somebody screamed, "Call the police," and I said, "No!" And I just fired the gun, and this big noise went off, and then I grabbed the phone and got the hell out of there. But I wasn't even in that room. I mean, it just was an explosion. I moved, they moved, the gun went off, and it was like, ah! And it was that fast.
Betty shot Linda in the head and the chest, killing her instantly. Dan was shot in the chest. One bullet hit a wall and another hit the nightstand. Dan didn't die instantly, and as he attempted to get to the phone, which was next to the nightstand, she yanked it out of the wall so he couldn't call for help. After murdering Dan and Linda, Betty says she just drove, eventually pulling up to a payphone, not even really knowing where she was, and called a friend and told her what she'd done. And then she went to see her daughter Lee, who was with her boyfriend. Meantime, Betty's friend called Brad, who was still at Betty's home with her children, and told him that Betty had said that she'd shot Dan and Linda. Thinking of the children, Brad didn't want to wake them up with a call to the police, so it was around 7 a.m. when Brad drove to Brian Forbes' home, who lived down the street. He was a lawyer and a mutual friend of both Dan and Betty.
Who was Brad Wright, as far as you knew?
He was Betty's boyfriend.
What happened when he came to your house?
I was sitting at the kitchen table when my wife Gail, who'd obviously just woken up, came to the kitchen door and said that Brad is here.
Brian went to greet Brad, and that's when he was told that Betty had done something to Dan and Linda.
He told me that he thought that Betty had shot Dan and Linda. And I said, "Why do you think that?" And he told me that a friend of Betty's had called him on the telephone and told him that Betty had told it to her. He said that the woman who called him was named Diane Black. And I said, I asked him if he called the police yet, and he said no, he didn't want to call from the house where the kids were. He had spent the night at the street in her house with her.
When he was telling you this, what can you describe his emotional state?
He was clearly upset.
So it looked as though this was something he was obviously taking seriously.
Oh, yes.
Brian told his wife to call the police, but they didn't take that call very seriously because they didn't have a lot of information. It was then that Brian asked if Brad knew how to get to Dan and Linda's home, and he said that he thought he could find it.
Brad had a Porsche that was a pretty fast car. I was a little nervous driving over. He went awfully fast, and he didn't make any wrong turns. Got us right there within, I guess, 10 or 12 minutes. It was a pretty amazing ride.
They pounded on the front door, but no one answered. And when they went around the house, Brian saw a window that was open just a little bit, and he was able to shimmy his way into the laundry room.
Got inside the house, I was yelling Dan's name and Linda's name as loud as I could, thinking that they might be asleep, or they might be in bed together, or they might be hurt someplace. I was trying to find them. I didn't want them to be disturbed by having an intruder get into the bedroom, so I was yelling to let them know I was in there. Heard no response.
He ran up the stairs 2 at a time, turned left toward the bedroom door, and went inside.
Went over to Dan and reached down to his throat from this position here and put my thumb and fingers on his neck, on his carotid arteries right here, to see if I could feel any pulse. There was none. It was cold. I did the same thing with Linda.
The double homicide shocked San Diego.
We have an all-units broadcast for Elizabeth Ann Broderick, who we believe is his ex-wife. We believe she has some information that might bear on this case.
They would find Betty Broderick. A few hours later, she turned herself into police. Betty went on trial for 2 counts of first-degree murder. The thing is, she never denied killing Dan and Linda, but she would say that her crime wasn't premeditated, that she'd only gone over there to talk to them. During the trial, Betty claimed that she'd been a battered wife, driven over the edge by years of psychological torment and physical and mental abuse by her ex-husband. That Betty shot Dan and Linda in self-defense after years of abuse. Here's defense attorney Jack Early.
A controlled, domineering relationship. It's called all different things. Some people call it battered woman, how they behave, how they do certain things. Someone who controls their life, whether it be through physical force, emotional force, or with threats. And you will hear that during this period of time and through the relationship, that a lot of the elements that were there, that are present in those kind of relationships, were present in Elizabeth Broderick's relationship with Daniel Broderick. You will hear that at some point in time, Elizabeth Broderick got in a fit of anger from Dan, got a black eye. It was seen by some people at a Blackstone ball that they went to. And what it was, and what they'll tell you, that has to do with at least the psychological effects of battering. It's not that only if you are somebody who keeps hitting somebody that makes that relationship, but if you are somebody who dominates and controls by fear and physical pain, that there are certain responses, a certain way people react. And you will hear that Daniel Broderick would rip a door off a closet, throw it out the window, would smash the garage door, smash motorbikes, smash lawnmowers, would smash aquariums, would throw and kick the dog in fit of anger when he was angry at people. And you will hear that in their family it was behind closed doors.
The defense presented expert witnesses who would testify to Betty's mental state at the time of and before the killings. The defense argument that Betty's responsibility for the killings should be mitigated because of this abuse. Betty testified that she felt completely powerless, that her ex-husband Dan held all the cards in their marriage, and even more so after their divorce.
There was never a single night I put my head on the pillow and knew I'd have a roof over my head. That house was in Dan's name. The car was in Dan's name. I had no flow of money that was guaranteed by anybody. It was just a little here or a little there or whatever Dan felt like. And I felt absolutely victimized. I felt like any time he wanted to just jerk me around, he'd just do that, and I was tied to the end of the string with him, and he did that, and my life went like that.
And it was because of her powerful ex, and his actions had made it impossible for her to get a fair settlement in their divorce.
I was suffering terribly from the effects of the tremendous and relentless stress of the situation that I was in. I was in great pain. I was suffering. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I couldn't function. I was terrified of what was happening and what was going on. And I felt helpless and defenseless at that time to prevent it or make it stop or to defend myself.
Betty portrayed herself as the victim, that she had financially supported her husband through medical and law school, and that when he became successful, he dumped her for a younger woman. Prosecutor Carrie Wells would present a very different case, that Betty was narcissistic, jealous, and vindictive, that she'd been rejected by her prominent husband, who was a high-powered attorney, who couldn't take the rejection, that her husband had left her for a younger woman.
She can't and won't deny that she killed Dan and Linda Broderick. She told too many people that morning that she did it. She called one friend and said, "I shot Dan. I finally did it." Did she have a motive? Absolutely. And it's probably the oldest and most common motive there is. I said it at the very beginning. Hate. Pure, unadulterated, intense, obsessive, jealous hate. Counsel himself, I think, was the one who brought up the phrase about a woman scorned. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. I think perhaps the phrase might more appropriately be hell hath no fury like a person scorned, because being scorned or being romantically rejected is pretty common to both sexes. And being hurt, being angry, and even wanting some sort of revenge over it is universal. Most people put the hurt and anger behind and move on with their lives. Elizabeth Broderick chose not to. And you will see that it was a choice that she made to keep that hate alive. With her, that hate became her life.
Wells focused on the brutality of the murders.
She didn't just panic and run out of the house. What she did was to walk all the way around the bed, over to where Dan was lying, to where, as she later told someone, she could hear him gurgling in his own blood. And what she did was she picked up the phone and ripped it out of the wall, literally tearing the cord in half. And she did it in her own words so he couldn't save himself. There would be no chance to call for help.
Betty's trial ended in a hung jury. 2 jurors held out for manslaughter. A second trial began in December of 1991. The jury had 3 options: first-degree murder, second-degree murder, or manslaughter.
We, the jury, in the above entitled cause, find the defendant, Elizabeth Ann Broderick, guilty of the crime of murder.
Elizabeth Broderick sat calmly with the hint of a smile on her face as the clerk announced the verdict of guilty of murder. But there were several anxious moments before they said it was murder in the second degree.
And fixed the degree thereof as murder in the second degree.
Betty Broderick was sentenced to 32 years in prison. After the sentencing, News 8 spoke to jurors.
I lost a lot of sleep over it. My emotions were touched many times. Like many of the jurors, during deliberation, we laughed and we cried.
I felt personally that I was leaning toward murder, that manslaughter was not a consideration in this case. And so I wanted to approach it from that standpoint and get everyone to agree that at least we could move it up into that category.
Nothing stuck out in my mind. It was just that it was murder. That was because I had never faced anything like this before in my life.
We went over her testimony quite carefully and found a number of inconsistencies. I don't want to be so strong as to say they were lies, but they certainly were inconsistencies. But it became a question of how did Betty Broderick perceive the world? And perhaps she perceived the world a little bit differently than most of us did.
I sympathize for her. I sympathize very much for her family, for her kids. You know, it's just a human response. But I just don't think we can let our emotions and our sympathy get in the way with justice.
Since Betty Broderick's conviction, she's gone up for parole multiple times and has been denied because, according to the parole board, she didn't show remorse or acknowledge wrongdoing. Her next parole hearing will be in 2032 when she's 84 years old. Up next, Criminal Mischief bonus content. Here, my co-host, Brandon Morgan, and I discuss the case in more detail. And as always, thanks for listening. From Cloud 10, Criminal Mischief is a pie-in-the-sky production, recorded in the beautiful Pacific Northwest. We're produced by Brandon Morgan and myself, music by Soundstripe. I'm Carolyn Osorio, your writer and host.